of song, said warrior bard, though the world betrays thee, one sword at least thy right shall guard, one faithful heart shall praise thee. The minstrel fell, but the foeman's chain could not bring that proud soul under. The heart he loved ne'er spoke again, for he tore its cords asunder, and said, no chain shall sully thee, thou soul of love and bravery. Thy songs were made for the pure and the free, they shall never sound in slavery.
Curlew Quarterly celebrates the lives, homes, and work of poets, writers, and distinct professionals living in New York City. Its quarterly journal pairs distinguished prose, poetry, and fiction with intimate photographs and interviews. Each issue begins with a bird's-eye view of Brooklyn's residential real estate market. Above all, Curlew Quarterly is curated with the belief that the written word is powerful, and that New York will always have a place for anyone bold enough to take on the city with a pen and paper in her hands, as well as a few ideas and a dream in her heart. This is episode number 2 of Curlew Weekly, and my name is Isaac Myers III. I'm the editor of the journal Curlew Quarterly, and this afternoon, our guest is Mr. Andrew Jimenez.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing great.
Great. I'm going to tell them a little bit about you, and I'm going to read this biography that you sent me just this afternoon.
Great.
So, a graduate of the New School's MFA program, Andrew Jimenez is an editor at Friction magazine and is working on a novel that reimagines the early life of Abraham Lincoln. His writing has appeared in the Paris Review Daily, Friction, and Luna Luna. He lives in Brooklyn.
I do.
Is that it?
That encapsulates my entire life.
Awesome. Well, how are you doing this Sunday afternoon?
I'm doing really good.
Nice.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Glad to have you on and to have made the time, and thankful for your contribution to issue number 1, which was the first issue.
Yeah.
Last summer.
And thanks for letting me write this too. This is sort of it was my first time doing a piece of this nature. Normally, I either write creative nonfiction or fiction. So writing something that was a bit more journalistic, a book review of sorts, was a really great opportunity. So thanks for letting me do it.
Thanks for working on it. So it's the title of the piece is Bed-Stuy as a Model for Social-Democratic Reform in the United States. Michael Wordsworth's The Battle for Bed-Stuy. Bed-Stuy as a Model for Social Democratic Reform in the United States. So you're living in Bed-Stuy, and as you're working on this, are you looking out the window at all, to figure out what's right next about your neighborhood? Or
It's funny because I do that all the time. My desk is set up by the window in the front of the house, and I'm constantly looking at the people going by on the street, and there's always people hanging out, walking their dogs, sitting on their stoops. So that informs a lot of my work day to day, and especially as I was writing this piece, I paid attention to that, I think, more than usual.
Was there any specific thing that you remember observing during that time as you were writing it? So I know it was a while ago. But.
It was, but I think just the biggest thing overall was, you can read about things in a book, but I think experiencing them firsthand is always a much better learning experience than reading about something, which is maybe not the best thing to say for a writer to say. But in the book talks a lot about how one of the greatest things about the neighborhood is the fact that the people who live here are engaged in the place that they live, and they're proud of the place that they live. And I came from the suburbs where I grew up, and people are proud enough of their homes and stuff, but there's something about the people of Bed-Stuy that the houses are generally, at least in my part of the neighborhood, handed down from generation to generation, and there is a lot of pride in the ability for people to own their own homes. There's a sense of self-worth and determination that I think is represented in the brownstone and the brick of the buildings, and to see that actually happening on the street as you're writing about it is a gift, I think, to be able to see something that's just on the page happening actually in real life.
Nice. Cool. Well, how about you want to give the piece a read and then we'll chat for a little while afterwards?
Sure. Sounds good.
All right.
Okay, so it opens up with just a little snippet of an interview that was printed in Jacobin magazine in the fall of 2016. The interview is with Matt Karp and a couple of other people. And somebody asked a question to Matt Karp about the Bernie Sanders campaign. So the question is, in the years leading up to Occupy Wall Street, the U.S. left seemed influenced by strains of anarchism. Many of these tendencies rejected structural critiques of capitalism and traditional forms of left-wing organization. It may be safe to say that post-Sanders, the general moment is more informed by social democracy. Would you agree with that characterization of the left? And Matt replies, the Sanders campaign was also a return of the U.S. left to electoral politics in a serious way, which opens up opportunities and challenges of its own. I'm hoping that Sanders' surprising success is a reminder that elections are something the left should take seriously and participate in. I'm not saying that the struggle should be restricted to elections, but it's hard to imagine any kind of meaningful left victories occurring without an electoral component. There is an opening for social-democratic policies at all levels, but at the same time, there are many challenges that come with that kind of strategy. How do you enact social democracy on a state or local level? You really can't. To even win the barest essence of social democracy, like a national healthcare system, you can't do that by winning city council seats. We need to engage in lower-level electoral politics while continuing to build a national movement. And so my piece itself begins. As a historian of slavery's relationship to power in the 19th century America, Matthew Karp is no stranger to critiques of capitalism, but what of his assessment as social democracy at the local level? It's easy to be cynical about the effectiveness of grassroots organizing and the power of local politics when participatory democracy is measured in small donations facilitated by multinational banks who are happy to charge service fees on each transaction. And the recent liberal successes of marriage equality and health care were fought on the federal level, and won only after receiving moral blessings from corporate America. But social democracy relies on local energies to envision real-world policies, which monolithic structures by their very nature can support but not enact. To see what social democratic policies look like locally, we need only to look at the work of politicians, community groups, and activists in Bedford-Stuyvesant, beginning in the mid-20th century. Michael Wordsworth's comprehensive The Battle for Bed-Stuy, The Long War on Poverty in New York City, details the effects of capital flight, joblessness, price gouging, redlining, urban renewal, and decay that threatened the neighborhood in the early 20th century. And Bed-Stuy's struggle against these effects, for better primary schools and basic city services, for a community college and hospital, for jobs, and for representation in local government, exemplify local-level social democratic ideology in action. As demographic changes began to settle in the 1940s, and blacks and Caribbeans joined the ranks of homeowners in Bed-Stuy, block associations sprang up among the stoops and steeples of north central Brooklyn's handsome brownstone streets. Untethered to any political party or area of academic study, the associations were comprised of small groups of Bed-Stuy citizens concerned with issues like beautification and juvenile delinquency. Initially, members were more likely to organize a garden club than a protest, but nevertheless, the seeds for Bed-Stuy's future activism were planted here. When these efforts gained federal attention in the 1960s, it seemed for a brief moment that the Great Society might be able to merge the demands of civil rights movement with the promise of the New Deal. Despite this, in the end, failure resulted more from a self-interested bureaucracy concerned with preserving social order over ceding power to the poor than from the inherent weaknesses of either local American political structures or the initiatives themselves. Bed-Stuy fascinates, Wordsworth writes, because it was simultaneously emblematic and exceptional. It epitomized the process by which urban black communities in the mid-20th century grew in population, were ravaged by capital flight, and organized to take political action. Far from the monolithic zone of suffering and blight the term ghetto implied, Bed-Stuy was a diverse community composed of both the desperately poor and the upwardly mobile, and those socioeconomic contrasts often overlapped with the cultural cleavages between people whose roots were in the American South and those who hailed from the Caribbean. In the late 19th century, the abutting neighborhoods of Bedford and Stuyvesant Heights had been converted from farmland into upper-middle-class bedroom communities of mostly German, Irish, and Italian families. During the Great Depression, many residents, unable to afford their property taxes and eager to get out before they owed more than the houses were worth, sold their homes. Still others defaulted altogether. The completion of the A train in 1936 connected Harlem with Brooklyn. At the same time, blacks from the American South and the Caribbean were moving to the city, where work, though not plentiful, was still to be found more readily than in rural areas. By the 1950s, New York City was home to almost 750,000 black people, more than any other American city, half of which lived outside Manhattan. Still, it was difficult to figure out how many called Bed-Stuy home because nobody could define exactly where Bed-Stuy was. A neighborhood whose borders were defined by racism, the name Bedford-Stuyvesant hadn't even come into popular usage until around 1939. One War on Poverty study went so far as to say Bedford-Stuyvesant is wherever Negroes happen to live. So when local community groups in the 1960s defined Bedford-Stuyvesant as a singular community, they were tacitly acknowledging that racism set the parameters for their efforts. World War II created enormous job growth in the Navy Yard, offering the black working class of Brooklyn a rare opportunity at economic equality. But when the war ended, the Navy Yard closed down much of its operations. While most of the country was enjoying a post-war boom, white flight kept black Brooklynites from most of the spoils. Capitalism followed the money to the suburbs, while racism kept black workers out of the city's Social-Democratic contract with the unions that protected what few blue-collar jobs remained. An estimated 45% of black employees lost their jobs, and unemployment among black Brooklynites rose to double that of whites. Underlying it all, Wordsworth points out, was redlining, the process by which banking and mortgage institutions, with guidance from the federal government, conspired to withhold credit from neighborhoods considered to be risky. The practice, somewhat ironically, was the result of a New Deal effort to revive housing by performing risk assessments for each segment of the market. Racism, like any ideology, manifests itself through a series of common practices, and though by itself morally neutral, capitalism turns a profit through the commodification of common practices. Thusly, areas of the housing market where black residents resided were valued lowest. In Bedford and Stuyvesant Heights, whites who had remained through the Great Depression saw the value of their homes drop, and their eventual departure further contributed to the devaluation of Bed-Stuy's housing stock. However, it wasn't hard to find among the poverty pockets of affluence, particularly on the leafy east-west residential streets in Stuyvesant Heights. Wordsworth describes the residents of these spacious, if a little run down, brownstone and limestone row houses in three broad groups. The first was 20th century black elites, whom W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth. Doctors, lawyers, realtors, and small business owners. They were long established Northerners who, while preaching black solidarity, often maintained classist attitudes about the influx of poorer, less educated Southerners. This dynamic would later complicate the struggle for improvement and services during the War on Poverty. These Southerners comprised the second group, intellectuals and thought leaders who had attended black universities and earned master's degrees. Many were career social workers or highly influential preachers. Lastly, there was a growing number of West Indians who had often worked 2 or 3 jobs in order to buy house. Among them were the parents of Shirley Chisholm, a Barbadian who was the country's first black member of Congress. Chisholm remembered that, due to their work ethic and obsession with their children's education, Barbadians were known throughout Brooklyn as black Jews, a stereotype they were proud to adopt. Many West Indians, upon arriving in America, were surprised to find themselves, despite their vast cultural differences, lumped in with African Americans. Chisholm herself wrote in her memoir that there was no such thing as a black community in Brooklyn while she was growing up. These differences carried over into politics. While African Americans were still wary of the Democratic Party, the first non-whites to make political headway in New York City were of Caribbean descent, and they did so as Democrats. Caribbeans in Bed-Stuy also formed Paragon Progressive Credit Union, which, by 1970, had over $5 million in holdings, and with 5,000 members was the largest credit union in the country. Establishing funding for scholarships, home loans, and renovations, it provided the financial impetus for the restoration, preservation, and anti-poverty programs to come. And so, despite obvious racial barriers, Bed-Stuy, boasting a 15 to 20% owner occupancy rate, represented the fulfillment of many aspirations among the upwardly mobile families in the central Harlem ghetto. Because many of these homeowners rented out one or more of the units within their brownstones, an estimated 25 to 30% of local families lived in an owner-occupied building. Another 10% were owned by people who lived nearby. There still existed plenty of buildings with too many tenants, or, in the case of those that had been abandoned, too little. But the high home ownership rates in Bedford-Stuyvesant marked a stark contrast with Harlem, and indeed with most other areas that earned the ghetto label in the wake of the Great Migration. The summer of 1945 was a season marked by violence. Teenagers vandalized and robbed stores across Brooklyn. Gangs with names like the Socialist Gents, the Saints, and the Brewery Boys staged massive rumbles in which young men attacked each other with penknives, ice picks, bayonets, or worse yet, zip guns they'd cobbled together out of curtain rods, coffee percolators, and blocks of wood. The teen murder rate had doubled since 1940, and J. Edgar Hoover, then the head of the FBI, said the crisis of juvenile delinquency was approaching a national scandal. The post-war years of capital flight only exacerbated the problem. Newspaper pages were stained with stories of teenage veterans returning from World War II and joining gangs, adding an element of paramilitary leadership to the raw enthusiasm of younger boys. But these tales largely neglected the attack by retreat that white flight inflicted on the nation's cities. Activists in Bed-Stuy at the time were staging their own battles against price gouging in local stores where quality food and other goods were already scarce, the lack of a neighborhood hospital, urban decay, and job scarcity. The high level of dedicated home ownership in Bed-Stuy lended a special quality to community organizing. In a neighborhood of long blocks of uniform row houses with no lawns and few public parks, block associations formed to help preserve and beautify the shared community space of the streets. A walk through an association block provides a refreshing atmosphere, the Amsterdam News reported in 1948. Here and there are found new trees planted along the streets that were bought through the block association. Yards are kept. Homes look inviting with trim, neat windows. Radios are always kept turned low. All is serene. Dogs travel on leash and are curbed. Refuge and garbage cans are covered and placed on the sidewalks only a short time before the disposal trucks makes its collection. It wasn't long before block associations began to come together to form larger groups, Woodsward writes, the most active of which was the Bedford-Stuyvesant Neighborhood Council. By the mid-1950s, it represented more than 100 block associations and had begun organizing to expand access to public transport and protest the withdrawal of city services from majority black areas. Members of the talented 10th who had entered local politics, like Thomas R. Jones, were now reaching out to these community groups, only just becoming aware of the power they had to affect change in their neighborhood. The Bedford-Stuyvesant Neighborhood Council was the place where streets linked up with elites. While the council fought, on the one hand, to beautify the neighborhood, it also looked for help to stop the wave of teen delinquency and violence on the other. Elders wondered why gangs wasted so much energy on fighting each other and dodging police, and why teens took such mirthful pleasure in killing one another. To Bed-Stuy homeowners, this behavior seemed to reflect a rising tide of nihilism that threatened to engulf the community they were working so hard to build and maintain. But the gang members themselves saw things in a much different light. Gang involvement was about finding routine in a life that otherwise promised very little. Sonny Carson, who rose to fame in the 60s as a black nationalist, wrote in his autobiography, The Education of Sonny Carson, of his life as a leader of the Bishops in the 1940s. purchasing coconut custard pie, then walking all the way uptown, shaking people down who look like they had money. In the black community, this means making them give you a nickel or a dime. Buying wine, looking for the pushers to purchase some marijuana, going to someone's pad, getting high, winding up in bed with one of the girls, invading the present enemy, the Beavers or maybe the Robins or the socialist gents, dodging the police all the time. To Carson, Wordsworth surmises, the Brooklyn delinquent, not unlike James Dean's character in The Rebel Without a Cause, appeared as an authentic masculine figure parading across landscapes shot through with apathy and despair. In November 1946, the Brewery Rats, a gang comprised primarily of Italians, whose home base was an abandoned Pulaski Street brewery on Bed-Stuy's north side, broke into a Jewish community center in a neighboring South Williamsburg. They didn't injure anyone, but they trashed the place and protested that the community center should serve everyone, not just local Jews. Shocked and concerned, parents turned to a group called the Brooklyn Council for Social Planning for help. Their efforts would ultimately change the course of social reform in the United States. In the 1930s, Clifford Shaw, a sociologist from the University of Chicago, developed the thesis that young crime resulted not from antisocial behavior in the individual, but from the breakdown of social structures in rapidly changing urban communities, a phenomenon he called social disorganization. Saul Alinsky, a former student of Shaw's, incorporated this theory into a style of community organizing less focused on establishing social control within communities than on confronting outside power structures in order to demand better services. Taking a page from Alinsky's book, the BCSP hired Leo Laughlin, whom Wordsworth describes as a streetwise social worker in his late 20s. As a detached worker, Laughlin was tasked with infiltrating the brewery rats and diverting their antisocial urges towards more positive pursuits. In June 1947, Laughlin began insinuating himself into the brewery rats' world. He hung out in candy stores, betting shops, and empty lots. He threw coins into jukeboxes, flipped cards, and spent long hours chatting on stoops. He helped organize dances and managed a sandlot baseball team. He picked up the gang slang and befriended their leaders. To convince the boys he wasn't a cop, he scampered away like one of them when the officers raided their holdouts. Laughlin was able to learn a lot about what motivated the brewery rats' behavior. Like the activists and block associations, the gangs were, in their own way, fighting post-war malaise. Alongside veterans who returned from combat to a deflated job market were young men who had lost their jobs when the war ended. Traumatized, shiftless, and uneasy about the future, they found stability, structure, and leadership opportunities among the gangs. Maintaining that constructive activities can be substituted for destructive ones, Laughlin reported to the BCSP board that it wasn't a love of violence that drove them to rumble, but a desire to build group solidarity and self-worth. A classical socialist reading of post-war urban America would say the environment that produced youth gangs in the 1940s was a direct result of the failure of capitalism to serve the disenfranchised. As a system which operates on the principle of ever-increasing wealth, it places no value on catering to those from whom it can produce no profit. While Wordsworth does not frame his telling of Bed-Stuy's social reform programs leading up to and including the War on Poverty years in these terms, Laughlin's efforts, in many ways the proto-blueprint for the federal War on Poverty, descend from this line of reasoning. One of the first ways he gained gang members' trust was to use his connections to get the most outstanding among them jobs in government. Next, he persuaded the brewery rats to move their headquarters to a row of abandoned shops nearby the rat-infested brewery. They spent 1948 cleaning, renovating, and fixing up the storefronts, which they operated under the name Club Caliph. They had quit vandalizing shops, and now took pride in maintaining one, from which they organized baseball tournaments, dances, and fundraisers. Laughlin suggested they collect dues and run the club according to democratic procedures, so they elected officers and drew up a constitution. The brewery rats were unionizing. Meanwhile, the board of the BCSP was working on a plan to organize the wider community. Focused on the area around Tompkins Park, the largest public green space in Bed-Stuy, they formed the Tompkins Park Neighborhood Council, which included parents, teachers, priests, police, and shopkeepers. They supervised Laughlin and raised funds for the Brewery Rats Clubhouse. When Laughlin, considering his work done, left 2 years later, the TPNC petitioned the city to have the brewery demolished and work directly with the Brewery Rats on a campaign to get the community involved in cleaning up the streets. Wordsworth states, the results supported BCSP's premise that a previously undefined neighborhood with no set borders or unifying characteristics could redefine itself as a community, and that through such a process a new form of place-based political organizing could proceed. A post-structuralist perspective affords a slightly different view, one that puts the goals of individuals in the context of different organizational power structures. The teens, disenfranchised by a political system stymied by racism and beholden to capital interest, focus their energies on physically destructive means of finding acceptance and power. The community groups, with their connections to the neighborhood and local government, were able to provide the infrastructure and funding to address the desires of gang-involved youth while respecting their need to maintain control over their own hierarchical power structures. Their efforts suggested that Brooklynites were increasingly linking youth behavior, social conditions, grassroots community action, and political power. Looking to repeat and institutionalize the success of BCSP and TPNC, Mayor William O'Dwyer, who'd established the New York City Youth Board in 1948, promoted an aggressive form of social work that targeted children and families who had not requested help and, in some cases, resisted it. The animating goal was to reach the unreached. The Youth Board set social workers up in schools and housing projects where they would identify at-risk youth and refer them to private agencies that provided vocational training, after-school supervision, and sports programs. Additionally, the Youth Board worked with the BCSP to establish the Brooklyn Detached Worker Program, which stationed social workers in 4 areas, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, and South Brooklyn, and tasked them with infiltrating and reforming gangs. One of the workers assigned to Bed-Stuy was Kenneth Marshall. Marshall had belonged to a youth gang in Bed-Stuy less than a decade earlier, so he knew the landscape. The Youth Board assigned him to work with the Green Avenue Stompers, one of the fiercest gangs in Brooklyn. Much like Laughlin, Marshall made himself popular by organizing dances in rented halls on neutral territory, which precluded the beef that typically resulted from gangs crashing parties on foreign turf. Meanwhile, he used his government contacts to find jobs for motivated stompers, which earned him the nickname the Job Man. In 1953, the Youth Board reported a 9.5% drop in delinquency rates citywide and 12.5% drop in arrests and referrals in targeted areas. When Marshall testified to these successes before the Senate Judiciary Committee, it was the first time many legislatures had heard of the pioneering work going on in New York City. In their 1960 book, Delinquency and Opportunity, A Theory of Delinquent Gangs, Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin argued that youth formed gangs not because of a lack of motivation to conform, but quite the opposite. In developing their theory, they borrowed from the late 19th century philosopher Emile Durkheim, who, along with Karl Marx and Max Weber, is credited with creating sociology and the social sciences. He coined the term anomie, which is defined as a concept of lawlessness or normlessness, in which individuals reject normal constructs of behavior for a social order of their own making. This differs from anarchy, which as a philosophy eschews all hierarchical order structures. Delinquents, Cloward and Olin argued, came to disregard social norms out of a frustration at the disparity between their aspirations and the pathways to achievement. If gang members could be introduced to opportunities in mainstream society, they might behave differently, and in doing so, break the self-perpetuating cycle of poverty that ensnared them. To effectively eliminate delinquency, Cloward and Olin envisioned a state in which basic standard of living is provided for all individuals, rather than only those with privilege. This argument is personified in today's calls for universal basic income. The work of BCSP and the Youth Board seems to support this theory, but as Woodsworth points out, it was never meant to be hegemonic. A competing theory put forth by psychologist Kenneth Clark found the root of delinquency grounded in legacies of racism. Other competing theories, such as the culture of poverty and the opportunity theory, fail because they do not address the social structures and institutions that create poverty, and so cannot present proper mitigating circumstances to control it. Despite this, no single theory shaped the war on poverty more than that of the culture of poverty, largely thanks to Michael Marrington's 1962 book, The Other America, which used the theory as its guiding principle. To put forth by anthropologist Oscar Lewis, the theory states that the poor are trapped in a multi-generational pattern of unemployment, disenfranchisement, ignorance, and hopelessness. Structural factors such as discrimination, economic shifts, and capitalist exploitation contributed to the conditions in which they lived. Once the poor were poor, they became caught in a vicious cycle. When parents are poor, their children are likely to go to failing schools where they lack the motivation or skills to succeed. Even those who did graduate would face dim job prospects. Their children, in turn, would grow up poor, thus entrenching the culture. Historian Alice O'Connor wrote that to scholars like Lewis and Harrington, The culture of poverty was more than an explanation for a persistent disadvantage. It offered a dissent from post-war optimism about the solvent of economic growth, and a dire warning about the consequences of failing to act. As the culture of poverty theory became embedded in the design of War on Poverty, it came under intense scrutiny. Wordsworth writes, "The emphasis of cultural conditions tended to preclude discussions of structural inequalities." Thus, Harrington unwittingly laid the basis for a federal assault on poverty that emphasized individual remediation rather than changes to the political climate. With its emphasis on the self-perpetuating aspects of lower-class lifestyles, Lewis's thesis was easily co-opted into arguments that poor people were to blame for their own poverty and deserved to be disciplined and shamed into changing their behaviors. When President Johnson tapped Sergeant Shriver to run the war on poverty, they adopted the slogan, "A hand up, not a hand out." By the 1970s, however, the war on poverty was dragging on. Programs operated with too little funding, community groups suffered from infighting, and poverty seemed as bad as ever. The mentality of the federal government towards the poor began to change, and in New York City, where the specter of bankruptcy loomed over the dingy streets, welfare programs were seen as wasteful, and the war on poverty increasingly began to look like a war on the poor. Programs that mandated maximum feasible participation from target populations gave way to policing that disproportionately targeted those same populations. It's easy to see how, without any greater self-examination, the culture theory became warped, the need for change shifting from the culture in power to the one that is in poverty. The oppressors, who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power, cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. But if we look at how theory originally operated, the culture as a whole is damaged, ruined by hundreds of years of slavery and oppression, and so those with privilege, themselves oppressed, and having no sense of themselves as members of an oppressed class, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors. Nevertheless, there were programs that did work, and their facilitators understood this catch-22, in which the powerless were expected to be the facilitators of their own empowerment, and took advantage of its rhetoric when communicating with the entities to which they reported. Two of the best examples in Bed-Stuy were the Young Mothers Program and the Women's Talent Corps. It's interesting that while the war on poverty began as a result of efforts to curb young male delinquency, the most successful of its programs were conceived and headed by women for the benefit of women. The Women's Talent Corps was the idea of Audrey Cohen, a well-to-do white woman in the 1950s, who founded an agency that employed college-educated housewives to carry out social science research. She called it Part-Time Research Associates, and its clients included AT&T, the consulting group McKinsey, the State Department, and the New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller. Seeing that the country's core economy was turning away from manufacturing, she envisioned the social service field becoming a major source of jobs in cities and set her sights on finding work for low-income women. In the field of community service, there exists a shortage of jobs, as well as a short supply of professional and non-professional workers to fill them, she wrote in her request for War on Poverty funds. If our efforts are to be directed forcefully against the condition of poverty, new jobs in community and social agencies must be developed, and persons presently unemployed or underemployed must be recruited and trained for them. Her plan was twofold. She would recruit and train low-income women for meaningful, socially useful jobs that would provide them with an alternative to welfare. Then, once employed, the women would be bridges between poor people and the schools, daycares, hospitals, healthcare clinics, social work agencies, and legal service centers they needed. From her years at Part-Time Research Associates, Cohen was not naive to the fact that creating these jobs would require massive institutional change, and for months she lobbied these sectors, especially schools. The Young Mothers Program was a brainchild of Olga de Freitas. In 1965, working out of a Salvation Army basement, she began enrolling pregnant teenage girls between the ages of 14 and 18 in education and life training classes. The next year, she received a $240,000 grant that allowed her to hire 10 staffers. By 1977, that number increased to 35. The program flew in the face of contemporary norms about unwed teenage mothers, in that it envisioned them not only as graduates, but as able to join the workforce and support their children on their own. In addition to their training, they received in-house nursing services, as some of the girls had already given birth once, and what de Freitas called conditional grants of $1.50 per hour of each class attended. It's not hard to see this stipend as a kind of living wage, as it used taxpayer dollars to pay the girls to attend school, while the programs themselves stand as examples of social democracy enacted from the bottom up. Additionally, as Wordsworth continues, like Young Mothers, Women's Talent Corps emerged from the initiative of one woman. It wasn't an idea conceived by federal poverty programmers, but it did make creative use of state resources to quietly advance the goals of the feminist movement. It also facilitated the entry of African American women into government jobs, which, as Michael Katz has observed, ended up being one of the lasting legacies of the Great Society programs in cities around the country. Equally significant was the fact that the Talent Corps explicitly repudiated the culture of poverty thesis. The training program reflects a basic philosophy about the teachability of uneducated people. It assumes that the culture of poverty does not affect the attitudes of most of the lower class groups in New York City, and specifically not of the women enrolled in the Women's Talent Corps program. Rather, trainees subscribe to the basic cultural values of the U.S. and strive for the same goals as other Americans. It assumes that these women are ready and able to become the new careerists of the future. What they need is help in developing and focusing their latent talents, rather than a major restructuring of their attitude towards society. By the 1970s, the Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration Corporation had funded a program that trained and hired unemployed young men in masonry and ironwork, and thanks to loans from Paragon Credit Union and Great Society grants, homeowners were able to afford repairs that helped maintain the beauty and value of their brownstones. Because of this, and the Restoration Corporation's other successes, the percentage of Bed-Stuy families with annual incomes over the city median increased by 80% in a decade. There were still other impressive numbers to report. While national poverty rates for blacks were still much higher than those for whites, they had plummeted from 55% in 1960 to 30% in 1974. The portion of black New Yorkers working in government had doubled from 10 to 20% and would continue to rise, especially among women, for decades after. This created a politically savvy black middle class, resulting from Great Society networks that linked African American leaders to the state. Though dropout rates among black students were still high, they had dropped by 30% between 1960 and 1970, and Medgar Evers College in nearby Crown Heights significantly increased college graduation rates among Bed-Stuy residents. The War on Poverty was a nationwide effort that began in the streets of 1940s Bed-Stuy. Proud new homeowners and civil rights activists linked up in at times tenuous partnerships, seeing one another as the answer to their problems. In the epilogue of A Battle for Bed-Stuy, Wordsworth surmises, in assessing the afterlife of the long war on poverty, it's tempting to conclude that the fate of places like Bedford-Stuyvesant was ultimately decided by forces so overwhelming: disindustrialization, the fiscal crisis, the lingering geography of racism, that there was nothing much any community organization could do to alter the conditions on the ground. Indeed, the very basis on which power had been constituted during the 1960s, namely the neighborhood, proved a remarkably weak fortress from which to fight against the economic and political restructuring of New York and the United States. In that sense, the war on poverty had disempowered the poor rather than empowering them. It had codified the institutions and processes through which low-income communities could gain concessions from local and federal governments, while at the same time ensuring those institutions and processes were maddeningly bureaucratic. The fact that those institutions had originally been designed to control the behavior of young, mostly black men made it all too easy to blame precisely that behavior and the communities that produced it when the institutions failed. Bureaucratization and personal ego trips, like when Governor Wagner temporarily refused to accept federal funding because it would go directly to community groups rather than first being funneled through the city's coffers, definitely played a large part in the failure of the war on poverty. But ultimately, failure of the war on poverty was that, much like the culture and opportunity theories, it couldn't address the systems that cause oppression because it was designed to operate within those systems. Not only the Democratic Party, which was the dominant party at the time, but the American democracy as a whole is controlled by capital, and capital's sole objective is to make money. Anyone who does not serve this end is the enemy. Within the government itself, there's something illogical about expecting localized community groups to address structural problems without enacting any structural changes at the federal level. While this doesn't preclude local change, it certainly adds unnecessary roadblocks to funding and prevents scalability, to borrow a business term. A government structure created to serve capitalist ends would never allow it. If it was idealistic for Bed-Stuy's community groups and civil rights activists to think they could change the structure of society as a whole, then so too was the capitalist idea that concessions to the poor could be a stalwart protection for capital against a tide of civil unrest. Behind Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy's talk of equality, the rhetorical language about war was the reality that black gangs scared white people. The principle that drives Nabisco and Target to release ads with rainbows during Pride Month in 2017 is the same one that told the 88th Congress in 1964 that the civil rights movement was bad for business. Protecting capitalism would be both the impetus and the downfall of the Great Society. Although goals like national universal health care and education reform are desperately needed at the federal level, state laws can be passed to, for example, divorce funding for schools and libraries from local property taxes, thus guaranteeing equal funding for both everywhere in the United States. Additionally, the recent liberal successes in mandatory health care and marriage equality were both passed nationally only after state laws proved the popularity and viability of each. In the case of health care, so long as certain general mandates are met, each state has latitude to run the program as they see fit. Since the needs of groups vary from region to region, a social democracy at the federal level is really little more than an interstate highway of federal funding to support work being done locally by the people who need it, for the people who need it.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Isaac.
How are you feeling?
My mouth is dry.
Yeah?
It's the longest time that I've ever spoken, I think.
Ever?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit to read there. Hal, so what are your first thoughts after having read it aloud?
There was a lot of stuff in there that I had forgotten I'd written.
Yeah. Anything come to mind in particular?
Yeah, there's that part right here towards the end, when I sort of get into the part about how the federal system sort of kept these local efforts from really working because they weren't properly funding the money to them as needed. I really liked that point and sort of like forgot that I had written it. And it's interesting now too, right here at the end when I talk about healthcare. Mm-hmm. It's like when I wrote this, it was what it was like still 2016, right?
Well, we started talking about this at first in October and November of 2016, mm-hmm. and then I think and then we had the interview in April of 2017, and then this went to print in August of 2017. Okay. So I guess you probably started reading the book probably in the fall of 2016. Yeah.
Yes, it was before the last presidential election, and now to see how healthcare is falling apart, week by week. It's interesting to read what I wrote about healthcare there. How as long as certain federal mandates are met, each state has latitude to run the program as they desire. It's funny to see the disparity between how the federal healthcare program is run state to state. Like in New York, for instance, it's very strong. Mm-hmm. Medicaid and Medicare have been expanded and continue to be expanded, while in other states, funding is almost non-existent and people are finding it really hard to get the healthcare that they need to this day. And I think that goes back to the point that I was first talking about how it's kind of ironic to expect the federal government to affect any kind of structural change when they are trying to maintain the structure itself. You can't use a structure to change itself.
But you have to do something.
Right.
Yeah.
You have to do something. So how do you do it?
That's the question. I think one of the things you emphasize in here in terms of that dilemma is I guess there's a term that I think, I'm not sure whether it's yours or Wordsworth's, but it's local energies. And I think one of the things that you point out in here is that those local energies were in some ways most apparent with the Young Mothers program. That's Olga de Freitas, and emerged from the initiative of one woman. It wasn't an idea conceived by federal poverty programs. How do you get the federal government to be an individual that can come up with individual ideas and individual initiatives? You can't really. But
yeah.
So what do you do instead?
Well, I think it's interesting, and when I'm thinking about stuff like this, I always use the analogy of when you're building a skyscraper. When you're building the Empire State Building, you don't start with the spire, right? You start with the foundation. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the federal government as the Empire State Building, you have to start on the ground. And the people on the ground in government is local governments. And I think reaching out to NGOs, as we call them nowadays, and really seeing what the NGOs are seeing at the street level, and saying, what kinds of programs do you see working, do you see not working? If the programs are not working currently, do you think it's because of a lack of funding? Is it a lack of staffing? Are they not working because they're not addressing the things that need to be addressed? And then the local government being able to say, okay, federal government, who creates money, we need money for these programs in this area. Here's the proof and the research to say this is what's needed. Provide funding, for a certain amount of years to test it out. If it works, then we can continue and expand funding. And I think that's really the best model for the way America can enact social-democratic policies in the United States. Because we don't have a socialist government, and I don't think that we should have a completely socialist government, but we should definitely have a government that is more socially minded than economically minded. Because the social fabric of any group of people is the determining factor for any kind of economic success. If you have a large majority of, not even a large majority, just a large percentage, if you have 25% of the population even that are living in poverty, that's too much. If you have 10% living in poverty, that's too much. And it affects everyone else in certain ways, and creates this mentality of us versus them, when really it's like we're all in this together, and the government is made for us.
What differences do you see between the culture of poverty versus the opportunity theory? Do you remember, those distinctions there?
Yeah. It's kind of like the culture of poverty theory is based on the idea that poverty is handed down from generation to generation. Parents, when they live in poverty, there's lots of factors that go into that poverty: a lack of education, a lack of resources. That's handed down. They live in poorer areas where the education is not as good. Their children go to those schools where the education is not as good. They don't have. I myself actually have an experience personally with this theory of looking at the problem of poverty. My first year in high school, and actually all my years of middle school, I went to a school in a really poor area in Fort Lauderdale, and I went there for a magnet program. Well, I lived in a wealthy area. My family was never very wealthy. They were always struggling just to get by, but they insisted upon living in a wealthy area so that we could have advantages and live in a neighborhood where we felt safe to ride our bikes around at night and stuff like that. But I went to this school for a magnet program for the arts. And when I went to high school the first year, the high school was really poorly run, and it kept losing its accreditation with the state. And even that aside, I would go to classes. When you went there for a magnet program, your classes were split up into two different parts of the school. There was a nice, brand new building that was for the magnet program, where you had all your arts classes. And that was really wonderful, and I found it amazing. But then you went to the older part of the school that was more run down for your core classes, science and math, PE, and you were mixed in with the population of the rest of the school. So you were mixed in, and the population of the rest of the school was 99% African American. The culture that they were living in was very different. The way they spoke to one another was very different. The kinds of music and movies and things that they watched were very different. So you always felt very much like an outsider amongst them. And most of the time I was very friendly, and I made a lot of friends. But I always kind of felt like an outsider. I started to become very comfortable with that after a time. But on the education side of it, especially in English, where I always excelled, I found myself correcting my teachers a lot when they were teaching things, like when they were teaching grammar. Or
how'd that go over?
Not very well. My English teacher in 9th grade hated me.
Sure.
But I was this naive smart-ass kid. Like, I didn't know that what I was doing was being a smart-ass. I was just like, oh, this is actually the correct way to do it, so I'm telling you it, and now you can use it for the future. Right. Yeah. I didn't realize what a dick I was being. And I felt kind of the same. I struggled very much in science and math. I was never very interested or good at it. And so when it came time to, like, get an A on a test, I didn't really feel comfortable going to my teachers about it because I felt like the teachers didn't very much care about what they were teaching either. And that's not any personal judgment on them. There's probably a lot of factors going into why they ended up becoming teachers or why they seemed to not be very into what they were teaching. But there was a low morality among the staff. And, even as a teenage student, I could tell that there was, even though I didn't know all the forces as to why. So I complained to my parents about it and like, why don't you just go to the homeschool here? It's a really good school. They're not always losing their accreditation. And I decided to do it, and it was such a marked difference between the two schools. I had teachers that were energized and engaged, and I learned so much. And even though the drama program there was not nationally recognized like it was at the first school that I had gone to, it was still a decent enough program. And I kind of liked it in some ways more because I was one of the better ones in the program instead of just like somewhere in the middle.
Sure.
So I always got like better roles in plays and stuff, which, cater to my ego.
Well, but it does that, but it builds self-esteem too, right? Which is important.
It does. So. It does. So this idea of the opportunity theory is, and the culture of poverty theory is that in the first school that I went to, I could see very much how poverty was built into the culture, just the everyday life, and it seemed like insurmountable. And then when I went to the better school, I was like, well, this is a completely different kind of environment where people's families have, a lot of them are like lawyers and doctors and stuff, and the kids in my school drove BMWs, which was totally weird. I remember my first year, people made fun of this one guy, Mike. They made fun of Mike because he drove a Mazda Miata instead of a BMW.
Oh, man. I hope Mike... Man, that must have been tough. Man.
It must be really hard. And the stark difference. So I think that's like the cultural poverty theory, right? These are two different cultures, and that's why one is poor and one is the other. Mm-hmm. And what the culture of poverty theory was looking at, it was looking at history to say, okay, this is what has happened to explain why it is how it is. And I think what happened was it was looked at as a predictive system by which we can tell how people are going to end up in the future. And it's not meant to be something that's prescriptive. It's meant to be something that's merely descriptive. And I think the opportunity theory, it's very, very linked to the culture theory, but I think it's more properly prescriptive in that it's like, okay, you have a culture of people that for a variety of reasons don't have the resources and so always suffer. Now, one of the reasons why they suffer is because they're not afforded the same opportunities as people in other parts of the economy are. Mm-hmm. So if we pump government and federal money into these communities to offer them the same kinds of opportunities that people in wealthier areas are offered, then in theory they would do much better.
In theory.
In theory.
So, it sounds like one thing that Wordsworth sort of pulls out is that Bed-Stuy's interest because there's this intersection between who he describes as desperately poor and also upwardly mobile, sort of sharing the same streets, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really, really, really cool part of it for me. One, because the language is really great. Yeah, you can just see it in those words. But also because I could see it in the streets even today. Mm-hmm. I live on a street in an area of Stuyvesant Heights that's fairly wealthy. It's like middle class to upper middle class. But even still, there are portions of even this area where the buildings are a little bit more run down. It's like not giant, but larger sized apartment buildings rather than 3 or 4 story brownstones. But in other parts of Bed-Stuy, you can really see like poverty on the street. You can see a lot more homeless people hanging around those areas than in this area where we live. Right now, I barely see homeless people there on the street. But if you walk just like over to the other side of Bed-Stuy, to like the north western side, you see a lot more homeless people hanging around on the street, a lot more abandoned storefronts and stuff, and you can really see the effects of what Wordsworth is writing about even to this day in those areas. And it's really funny when people first move to New York, one of the first things that people notice is like New York City is a sort of block by block kind of place to live. Mm-hmm. One block could be gorgeous and amazing and incredibly safe, and you literally turn the corner and all of a sudden it's like a desolate wasteland where you're afraid to walk around by yourself. And I think you can still see that in Bed-Stuy probably better than nowhere else.
Sure. And I guess I have to ask, you've been here in this home in Bed-Stuy for a little over a decade now. Mm-hmm. So tell us about 2007 compared to 2018, you know.
It's really different. The part of Bed-Stuy that's closer to Clinton Hill has gentrified a lot more rapidly than this area, and I think that's mostly because the land was there to develop on. There was a lot less home ownership in that area because that's the part of Bed-Stuy that used to be Bedford as opposed to Stuyvesant Heights. But even here in Stuyvesant Heights, I've seen a lot of change, both in the kinds of people who are walking around on the street and also the kinds of businesses that exist in the area now. When I first moved here in 2007, there was like 2 nice restaurants that you could go to. One place, Solomon's Porch, which no longer exists, which I'm really sad about. Now it's just like an ugly bodega. And then the other one is Peaches, which is still around and really great. But those were your choices. And now we have, I couldn't even count, how many great restaurants are in the area. And that's a really wonderful thing. I think the largest amount of change happened for this part of the neighborhood, at least during the Obama years, and that's probably due to a lot of factors. I know one of which was that government money was funded or was pushed into the area through a program that allowed local residents to open up businesses in the area. They were given grants to exist for a certain number of years. And they figured, I don't know what the amount of years was, but let's say it's 2 years. And they figured after those 2 years if the business was doing well and run correctly, then they wouldn't need funding anymore, and they'd be able to continue just on their profits. So that was a really nice thing, and I saw quite a few restaurants and other businesses open up based on that. There was also a burger joint that used to be open right down the street from my apartment that was actually opened by a community board member. And he was like there every day, sort of like the manager of the restaurant, even though he wasn't the manager of the restaurant, walking around asking everybody how they liked their meal, and saying he's like introducing himself and saying that he worked for the local community board. Is there anything about the neighborhood that he could help them change or make better? And that was really cool. It's too bad that restaurant is no longer in business, and I don't know why. They just closed one day and didn't say why. But it was very good, and a lot of people were always eating there. So the neighborhood has changed a lot. But I think one of the positives about the change that I've seen in Bed-Stuy as opposed to other neighborhoods like Williamsburg or Bushwick is that not all, but a lot of that change, at least in my area, has come from within. I see the same people here all the time. Still, even though I see a lot of new people, I still see the same old people. By that I mean the same people who have been here since I have been here and before. Mm-hmm. And so that's a really nice thing for me, to see that we now have like really nice places to go to eat, and it's not a food desert anymore. We have bars that we can go to instead of having to like travel really far and then come home late at night drunk. But at the same time, the community still has the same makeup that it always has had, and I think that's one nice thing.
So there's one film that I'd love to see that hasn't been made yet, that I think you'd enjoy as well, but the Leo Laughlin story. This is infiltrating the gangs and convincing them to do positive things rather than, reckless things. And it seems like it was really effective, and it'd be a fun film to see, I think, right? Because he is scampering away when the police come so that they think, that he's one of them, right? So,
yeah. And you've seen movies like that made with about the mob, right? About the Italian mafia. Mm-hmm. What's that one with was it Johnny Depp, right? Where he plays the guy who took down, was it Gotti, I think?
I'm not sure.
If my friend Chris were here, he knows all about movies, to be able to say, "Oh, Andrew, you're wrong. It's this guy in this movie." But I would love to see that movie too, man. I think it would be so good.
It would, I think so. Yeah.
The music of the time and the styles too would just be really amazing.
Yeah, and it seems like he made some really like impactful changes too, right? In terms of first they're taking down and graffitiing and really versus really destroying places versus opening up their own club, having dances, like organizing and it's whenever I read this essay I always like latch on to that as something that seems like still pretty possible.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's a truly American story too.
Oh yeah. Constructive activities can be substituted for destructive ones. And it's like that simple, right? Like
yeah.
All of the destructive things that you're doing, we can just do the same, have the same sort of energy and zest, and just do constructive things as well. And I think I'm interested in it because it reminds me of Malcolm X in his Zoot Suit days, right?
Yeah.
And obviously he was a genius, a very powerful and important mind. But before he actually made that turn, he was doing nonsensical things, And
yep.
Yeah. So,
and that's very true. That part about gangs not being an outlet for people who are nihilists, but being an outlet for regular people who have no other outlet for their energies, I think is a really, really important point, and one that's incredibly true. Mm-hmm. I think that's probably the truest point out of any in this essay.
Yeah, I think the phrase in here is finding routine in a life that otherwise promised very little, right? Just sort of that routine, that kinship,
Absolutely.
The Leo Laughlin story. Yeah, and maybe featuring the Job Man, too.
Yeah, Kenneth Marshall, did very much the same thing and became known as the Job Man. Yeah. I love that guy.
It's not bad, yeah. Yeah, well, did you have anything else, anything you wanted to add, or what?
No, I don't think so. I hope that the essay very much speaks for itself, and my sometimes botched reading of it was still effective for people. It's funny, as I was reading the essay, I was thinking back to when I used to do acting in the magnet programs that I was in, and I was thinking, man, like, imagine if I had to memorize any of this, like even memorize a paragraph of it. I used to memorize entire scripts for plays and be able to pull it off. I don't know how I used to do that. Maybe it's because I'm old. But no, other than saying, I hope this essay speaks to you in some way if you're listening to this, and makes you consider getting a little bit more involved in local politics, even if that just means going to the voting booth when it's not a presidential election. I think that would be a huge first step in helping to enact change at the local level, because that's really where all this stuff starts. I think part of the reason why Republicans are doing so well is because they overwhelmingly go out and vote in every single election. And regardless of whether or not you believe in their policies or what, the fact remains that nothing changes unless you make it happen in the way that we do that in the United States, is voting.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye.
Ta-ta. Yeah.
Toodaloo.
Curlew Quarterly celebrates the lives, homes, and work of poets, writers, and distinct professionals living in New York City. Its quarterly journal pairs distinguished prose, poetry, and fiction with intimate photographs and interviews. Each issue begins with a bird's-eye view of Brooklyn's residential real estate market. Above all, Curlew Quarterly is curated with the belief that the written word is powerful, and that New York will always have a place for anyone bold enough to take on the city with a pen and paper in her hands, as well as a few ideas and a dream in her heart.
In the ranks of death you'll find him. least thy right shall guard. One faithful heart shall praise thee. The minstrel fell, but the bowman's chain could not bring that proud soul under. The heart he loved ne'er spoke again, for he tore its folds asunder, and said, no chain shall sully thee, thou soul of love and bravery. Thy songs were made for the pure and the free. They shall never sound in slavery.